are true crime stories. These true crime stories are so awful that it's impossible to believe they happened, let alone that humans are capable of such horrors. Nonetheless, every one of these stories is real. Sometimes real life is much grimmer than fiction. Murder, kidnapping, treachery, torture, and death can all happen in real life. Hello everyone, and welcome to a brand new video on the channel. Before we get started with the video, don't forget to smash the like button, share the video, and subscribe to the channel. Now let's get started. Angela Hammond, default text. She was talking on the payphone with her fiancé about this mysterious truck that was cruising around the block. The vehicle then parks near her where the payphone is, and he gets out to look about with his flashlight as if he has forgotten something, before confronting Angela and abducting her. Her fiancé heard everything on the other end of the line and quickly drove to Angela's location. When he was doing so, he drove past the guy in the truck, and Angela was obviously shouting his name for aid. So he turns around and tries to follow the vehicle, but his gearbox fails, and the guy escapes. Angela has not been heard from again, and she was pregnant. Annie Borgerson. She may have been the victim of foul play or committed suicide. I also discovered that her parents' emails were supposedly hijacked later. It may be a case of self-inflicted violence or mental health concerns, but Annie's case is so unusual and tragic. The Hinterkaifeck murders. A family noticed footsteps in the snow heading to their farm, but no footprints leaving the farm. A few days later, they were murdered in their own house. There was evidence that the culprits were staying at their home or farm prior to the crimes. It's creepy since your home is meant to be the most secure place. It's hard to feel safe when you consider the prospect that your killer is living with you without your knowledge. Dorothy Scott. I was reading about Dorothy Scott recently. Her narrative is the saddest, and the bones of the deceased dog laid on top of her remains to deter scavenger canines. Also, her watch was stopped at the exact time she died. I can't believe he contacted her family so frequently and they couldn't trace the cause. I know it was the times, but the whole thing is really terrifying. Brandon Swanson. For those who are unfamiliar with Brandon's story, he was a 19-year-old who resided in Marshall, Minnesota. He was on his way home after a party celebrating his graduation from a community college in Canby, a town north of Marshall. On his way home, he crashed into a ditch. He was taking gravel roads for some reason, despite the fact that the roadway between the two towns ran directly north-south. I am guessing he took this route as a joyride since he enjoyed his car and driving in general. Or perhaps he had a little too much to drink at the party and didn't want to deal with any state police on patrol. He contacted his father for a ride and soon became tired of sitting inside his crashed car and began walking toward Marshall. He told his father that he saw lights of something nearby, then yelled, "Oh shit," to his father while still on the phone, and the call ended. Nobody knows what happened to him. Nothing was recovered, including his corpse and belongings. There's more to the story, but this is my summary. If you want to discover more, simply dig around. Brandon most likely slipped and fell in a river due to his inability to see in the darkness, was shot and buried somewhere by a belligerent farmer who despised people trespassing on his property and would rather shoot than ask questions, or was abducted by aliens, which would explain the lights. This case creeps me out because I live in southern Minnesota and am familiar with the Marshall region. It's primarily flat farmlands around here, so I don't see how someone could vanish into thin air in the middle of nowhere without a corpse or any remnants being discovered. The Bennington Triangle disappearances. From November 1945 to October 1950, 5 people went missing in the area, ranging in age from 8 to 70 for years. One was an experienced hunting guide, and the other was a 53-year-old woman who was characterized as a seasoned camper and hiker who knew the terrain like the back of her hand. I have hiked Vermont's Long Trail myself, and there are places where you feel like you're being watched by someone or something. In 2008, an instructor at Bennington College and experienced hiker got lost on the mountain, later recounted his strange experiences, and vowed never to hike the trail alone again. Setagaya family. The killer lingered in the house for hours, eating the Setagaya family's food, using the family computer, and sleeping on their couch. It's creepy because a killer rarely hangs around for hours after committing a crime, making themselves at home. Brandon Lawson. I ran out of petrol in middle of nowhere, Texas in 2013. Called the cops. Much of it is inaudible, but he implies he is being pursued into the woods and needs the cops. When the cops arrived, they discovered his truck, but nothing else. There has been no trace of him since. Katarzyna Zowada, the skin case. A few months later, A ship on the Vistula River comes to a halt after something becomes lodged in a propeller. What they discovered astounded everyone. Katarzyna Zowada's lost skin has been discovered. To be more specific, a suit made of human skin. Someone had severed all of the limbs and head, then made a bodysuit out of the remaining parts, which was likely worn by the murderer for some time. Despite public attention and heightened police interest every few years, a perpetrator has never been located. Cassie Jo Stoddart. They unlocked a basement door without her knowledge just before leaving. They turned off the electricity to scare her. They sat hiding until her boyfriend departed and she was alone, then put on masks, entered the house, and stabbed her. If that wasn't awful enough, a tape was discovered showing them plotting to assassinate her ahead of time. There was also video evidence of them immediately after killing her. Chris Kramer and Lisanne Froon. The disappearance of Chris Kramers and Lisanne Froon is another scary story that I find intriguing. Long story short, two Dutch girls visiting Panama decide to go on a hike the day before they were supposed to meet a guide for a tour, and they go missing that night. 10 weeks later, their bones and valuables are discovered downstream from where the girls were hiking. What scares me the most about this disappearance are the photos discovered in Lisanne's camera among the remains. The images range from the normal pleasant pictures of scenery and the girls posing with landmarks to cryptic pictures of the darkness, which many presume were attempts to utilize the camera's flash to notify rescuers. There was also a shot of Chris's back of the head with what appeared to be blood around her temple. The fact that no one knows what happened to these two when they were in the woods is the most disturbing aspect of this story. Daniel Laplante's murders. Daniel Laplante was a triple murderer. He murdered a nursery school teacher and her two children in 1987. After a tremendous manhunt, they were still unable to locate him. What happened was quite creepy. He was eventually discovered while on the run in the closet of a girl he had dated. She opened her door one night to find him standing there, dressed in her mother's clothes, makeup smeared on his face, clutching a machete. He bound her and her family, but the youngest managed to escape. As if that wasn't awful enough, they still couldn't find him 2 weeks later. The family, who had moved out, returned home and noticed Laplante in the window. The police were contacted, and they later discovered why he had been so difficult to find. Daniel had been residing within the boundaries of his ex-girlfriend's home the entire time. The Toolbox Killer. The account of Shirley Ledford's experience at the hands of toolbox killers Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris is the most horrifying thing you will ever read. After Bittaker forced Shirley to fellate him, repeated noises of an inflicted pounding can be heard, interspersed with loud screams, as Bittaker violently beat Shirley around the breasts and, to a lesser extent, the head. Bittaker then removed his pliers from the toolbox. Shirley then lets out multiple high-pitched, lengthy screams and cries of anguish as Bittaker alternately squeezes and twists her labia, clitoris, nipples, and breasts with his pliers. Bittaker then replaces the pliers to the toolbox. Banging sounds can also be heard throughout, which are said to have been created when Shirley writhed and flailed, coming into touch with the van's walls and its contents. Kelly Ann Bates. Bates was brutally tormented for days before her tormentor killed her. Here are some samples of what she went through. Kelly Ann Bates, 18 May 1978, April 16, 1996, was a 17-year-old British teenager murdered in Manchester on April 16, 1996. After 4 weeks of torture, Kelly's eyes were gouged out of their sockets 3 weeks before she drowned in a bathtub. Her partner, James Patterson Smith, committed these horrible atrocities. Junko Furuta. Furuta was a 17-year-old Japanese girl whose case became known as the concrete-encased high school girl murder case. Furuta was kidnapped by 4 teenage boys, and aside from the brutality of the assaults on her, the most disturbing aspect is that she was held at one of the kidnappers' houses, and his parents were present the entire time, knew what was going on, and did nothing to stop it. It's also quite unsettling that Furuta turned 17 while in captivity and facing these horrors. That's quite upsetting. To alleviate concerns about her kidnapping, the culprits compelled Furuta to call her parents and inform them that she would be staying at a friend's house for a time. Furuta was frequently raped, beaten, and tormented by her 4 captors before being slain. Kamiseika's parents were present in the home for at least some of the time Furuta was held captive, and despite her pleading for help, they did not act, later saying that they were too afraid of their son to do so. The murderers buried her body in a 208-liter oil drum packed with concrete. They disposed of the drum on reclaimed ground in KT, Tokyo. The Hiffy murders. In 1974, 2 men looting a hi-fi store in Ogden, Utah kidnapped and tortured 5 people. Only 2 of the detainees survived. Among the sadistic treatment of the detainees, violence includes kicking a pain into an ear and brutally raping a teenage girl who was later shot in the head. Corrosive drain cleaner was also forcefully administered to the hostages, resulting in terrible burns to their mouths and throats. They were not only forced to drink drain cleaner, but their lips were also taped shut, preventing them from spitting it out or vomiting it out. One of the victims, Oren Walker, was shot multiple times, strangled, and had a pen kicked into his ear, but he survived. The McStay family, Joseph McStay, his wife Summer, and their 2 children were brutally killed in Fallbrook, California in 2010. The 4 were then relocated by the killer and buried in a small grave in the desert, but their bodies were not discovered until 2013. For 3 years, they were assumed to have vanished. Forensic evidence revealed that all had been beaten to death with a sledgehammer discovered near the family's remains. Joseph McStay received 4 strikes to the head, while the family's youngest kid, who was 4 years old, received 7. Investigators also suspect the family was tortured before to their deaths. James Bulger. In 1993, 2-year-old James Bulger was kidnapped by 2 10-year-olds at a mall while his mother was distracted. After leaving the mall, the 2 lads took Bulger for a 2.5-mile walk. They scooped Bulger up and dumped him on his head, causing him to get a bump and wail, according to bystanders. The 2 then led him up an embankment and onto a set of railroad tracks, where they started torturing him. The trial revealed that at this location, one of the boys threw blue Humbrol modeling paint into Bulger's left eye, which they had previously shoplifted. They kicked and stomped on him, hurling rocks and stones at him. Batteries were implanted into Bulger's mouth. Police suspected that batteries had been placed into his anus, but none were located. Finally, a 22-pound 10 kilograms iron bar, referred to in court as a railway fishplate, was dumped on him. The iron bar struck Bulger's head, causing 10 skull fractures. Dr. Alan Williams, the case's pathologist, indicated that Bulger received so many injuries, 42 in total, that none could be identified as the fatal blow. Police suspected a sexual element to the crime since Bulger's shoes, socks, trousers, and underwear had been taken. The pathologist's findings read in court stated that Bulger's foreskin had been forcibly removed. Before leaving, the boys placed Bulger across the railway lines and weighted his head down with stones, hoping that a train would hit him and make his death appear accidental. A train sliced Bulger's body in half as his killers fled the scene. Bulger's decapitated body was recovered 2 days later, on 14 February. Amora Bain Carson, the 13-month-old infant who was tortured to death by her mother's boyfriend during exorcism. I'll tell the narrative by transcribing some details from each of their pleas. The baby's mother was Jessica Carson, and her lover was Blaine Milam. Jessica Carson received a life sentence, while Blaine Milam was given the death penalty. A true crime author who pretended to be an FBI profiler. In October 2018, 59-year-old true crime author Paul Harrison released his most recent book, Mind Games, in which he claimed to have personally interviewed over 100 of the most prominent serial killers. Described as the master of the true crime genre, the author of over 30 true crime books claimed to have spent 3 decades working as a police officer in the United Kingdom, serving as a dock handler, intelligence officer, detective, and later as a profiler. Harrison also stated that he worked closely with the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit in Quantico, Virginia, for 6 months in 1982. During his live events and press releases, the self-proclaimed master of true crime brags about his encounters with some of the most infamous serial killers, including John Wayne Gacy, Ted Bundy, Henry Lee Lucas, Aileen Wuornos, Jeffrey Dahmer, and Peter Sutcliffe, who allegedly told the author, "You seem completely indifferent to me. I am scared of you." However, less than a year later, the book was pulled from shelves after Harrison's claims to have interviewed the aforementioned serial killers were called into question. 7 former FBI agents, whom Harrison claimed to have worked with, told reporters that they had no idea who the author was. Any claim that he conducted interviews with those serial killers is completely false. Now, former FBI profiler Mark Safarik told the media. After the evidence became public, Harrison removed all of his social media accounts, but not before posting an apology on Facebook, claiming he felt weak, vulnerable, and utterly inept at decision-making. Harrison reportedly accused promoters of pressuring him to sensationalize the events, stating it was their intention to disseminate inaccurate information. Who is the world's stupidest criminal? On April 15, 2014, Dean Smith, 27, attempted to rob a local Barclays bank in South Wales because he was starving for money. Smith, dressed in a terrible disguise of sunglasses and socks over his shoes and armed with a bread knife, asked that the cashier hand him the entire till. An older gentleman in his 70s stood next to him and offered him £20 of his own money to leave, but Smith insisted. However, the cashier ignored his request and quickly pressed the panic button, leaving the robber empty-handed. When the police arrived on the scene, they quickly identified the perpetrator. How is that possible, you may ask? 30 minutes before the event, the attempted robber went to the same bank to alter his address, giving the teller all of his information. Smith was imprisoned for 2.5 years for attempted robbery and possessing a bladed weapon. Fighting felon. On September 1, 2017, Kansas City Police detained 24-year-old Sean Sykes after discovering a backpack carrying multiple drugs and 2 firearms in his car during a routine traffic stop. While being questioned, Sykes denied knowing anything about the findings and created an unusual strategy to conclude the conversation. When questioned about his address, Sykes leaned to one side of his chair and released a loud fart before answering. The questioning ended prematurely when the investigator was driven from the room due to the suspect's extreme farts. Charges were not filed at the time. However, Sykes was unable to stench his way out of trouble. On November 5th, cops stopped him again. This time, they discovered marijuana, crack cocaine, and a claimed stolen .38 caliber pistol. The farting felon pleaded guilty to 1 count of possessing cocaine, heroin, and marijuana with the intent to sell, as well as using a handgun to commit a drug felony. A drug-induced illusion almost cost a man his penis. On December 28, 2013, at a.m., 35-year-old Bonita Lynn Vila told her daughter to invite her boyfriend to the family trailer in Franklin, Indiana. Vila suspected that her daughter's 18-year-old boyfriend had assaulted her 2-year-old son. The man arrived about a.m. and Vila, assisted by 2 unnamed others, detained him against his will for 3.5 hours. When the 18-year-old began vehemently disputing the molestation allegations, Vila became increasingly irritated, out of control, and extremely mad. During the torture session, Vila threatened to tie him to a tree, shoot him in the head, and leave his body to be eaten by animals before giving him a choice, his life or his penis. The boy chose life, and Vila allegedly cut him deep with a box cutter before releasing him. According to the police report, the victim believes Vila wanted to scar him so that he would have to look at it every time he had sex in the future. However, the 18-year-old stated that he believed the trio would go to great lengths to hurt or kill him, and that one of them had recorded the incident. The woman claimed to be under the influence of marijuana at the time of the incident and eventually reached an agreement with prosecutors to avoid jail time. In November 2014, Vila was sentenced to 10 months of home detention, 6 months of probation, and anger management counseling. The disappearance of Brian Shaffer. True crime stories. Brian Shaffer's disappearance remains one of the most baffling unsolved mysteries in recent history. Brian, a medical student at Ohio State University, went missing in April 2006, perplexing his family, friends, and police. Despite significant investigations and widespread media coverage, no definitive evidence has been discovered about his location. The case remains open, a disturbing conundrum that continues to pique the interest of both the general public and those who have been personally affected by the tragedy. Timeline of events prior to the disappearance. The events leading up to Brian Shaffer's disappearance are both detailed and perplexing, with ordinary beginning of weekend celebrations culminating in an ongoing mystery. Brian, a second-year medical student at Ohio State University, was looking forward to relaxing with friends and celebrating the start of spring break on Friday, March 31, 2006. The night began ordinarily but ended in bafflement. Early evening. Dinner with father. Brian's evening began with a steak dinner with his father, Randy Shaffer. The supper was bittersweet. They were both still grieving Brian's mother's recent death, but still hoping for better days ahead. Randy noticed nothing unusual about Brian's behavior that evening. He was just being himself, looking forward to his forthcoming trip to Miami with his fiancée, Alexis Wagner. Late evening. Ugly Tuna Saloon. Brian met up with pals after dinner to go bar hopping around the South Campus Gateway complex, starting at the Ugly Tuna Saloon, a popular student hangout. Surveillance footage shows Brian and his companions entering the bar about PM. The group loved the lively atmosphere, partaking in the usual revelry of college students on the verge of a vacation break. Close to midnight, bar hopping, Brian and his buddies spent the night visiting other bars in the vicinity, as is common when spring break begins. Despite the festive atmosphere, nothing appeared awry, and Brian was observed enjoying the company of his friends with no signs of concern or strange behavior. Early morning hours. Last known sighting. The most essential and perplexing part of the timeline takes place in the early hours of April 1st. Brian and his companions went back to the Ugly Tuna Saloon to end their night. Surveillance cameras inside the bar caught Brian conversing with two ladies at 1:55 am, just before the bar was set to close. Brian seemed to vanish following this interaction. Despite a thorough analysis of security footage from the pub and surrounding area, there is no proof that Brian left the premises. This lack of footage has perplexed family, friends, and detectives, given the bar's layout and the placement of exit cameras appear to make it impossible for anyone to escape unobserved. Aftermath. The search begins. When Brian failed to arrive for his flight to Miami on April 3rd, alarm bells rang. His departure was unexpected and caused instant alarm among his fiancée, friends, and family. This marked the start of an intensive and ongoing search, as investigators tried to piece together how a brilliant young medical student could vanish without a trace. The investigation. The case of Brian Schaffer's disappearance is a story of hope, frustration, and mystery, representing the intricacies and limitations of missing person investigations. From the moment Brian was reported missing, law enforcement, family, and the community went on a never-ending search for answers, a search that, despite intensive efforts, has left many questions unanswered. Initial response and search efforts. The Columbus Police Department launched the investigation with a sense of urgency, knowing that the first hours and days following a disappearance are crucial. Officers, search dogs, and volunteers investigated the area surrounding the Ugly Tuna Saloon and the wider South Campus Gateway. Despite these attempts, no trace of Brian was discovered, not even a clue as to where he might have gone since his last reported encounter. The investigation focused on surveillance footage from the night Brian went missing. Detectives painstakingly studied hours of CCTV from the Ugly Tuna Saloon and other places, looking for any indication that Brian had left the pub. The strange truth that Brian was not observed exiting, despite the presence of only a few exits, all of which were under observation, added to the mystery. Key pieces of evidence and challenges. The key piece of evidence in the case, security film, raised more questions than answers. Investigators were perplexed by Brian's apparent disappearance from a crowded bar without being photographed. This oddity prompted intensive searches within the bar, including checks of exits and any potential hidden spots where Brian could have gone undetected or become imprisoned. There was no sign of a struggle or foul play within the bar. The technological limitations of the time exacerbated the investigation issues. While monitoring gave some insights, the quality and coverage were insufficient to accurately follow each individual's movements. Furthermore, the massive amount of data from cell phone records and financial transactions yielded no meaningful leads, as there was no movement on Brian's accounts or phone after his disappearance. That's it for today's video. If you liked what you saw, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more.